In this interview, we talk with Saya G. He's the founder of the world's most widely referenced, evidence-based natural health resource, Green Med Info. He started that in 2008 to provide the world open access to the evidence that we need that supports natural ways of living and, of course, eating. Saya is also a published author, and it has to be said, due to the evidence he's come across, a staunch advocate against GMOs. So let's join Alain and Saya now and find out what this resource is all about, and listen while Saya reveals all the fascinating information he's dug up about how the multinationals are telling us lies, and the fact that there are a whole raft of studies that prove that natural is best.
Good morning, Saya, and welcome to the Low Carb Paleo Show.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
How you doing?
Pleasure. Our pleasure. Good morning, Mark, as well, and our audience. So, Saya, I found you and the Global GMO-Free Coalition while I was doing research on my newest book, GMO 101. It seems like you and I have something in common. We want to get rid of GMOs in our food supply. You are also the founder of Green Med Info, which is an amazing website. Thank you for all the alternative information you provide. You should be on NBC and ABC, not on the Low Carb Paleo Show. But
I'd much rather be here. This is much more in line with my audience, I'm sure.
Okay. So before we get on that subject, can you tell us about your background and how you got where you are now?
Yeah, I mean, I have a story that's similar to a lot of folks who are in this sort of natural alternative medical field, which is that I was a pretty sickly child, and over the course of several decades of trying to figure out my own health issues, I was able to come to natural medicine and find solutions that worked for me. So, early on, it wasn't so much a vocation as it was a necessity for me to look at things like how diet affects health and adverse effects of drugs and then natural alternatives. And I actually went to college for philosophy, which was a really great experience. I focused on a type of philosophy that looked at really the origins of science and some of the fundamental assumptions behind how we do science, which is phenomenology. So after 5 years working on that topic, I decided to go off and work with troubled kids for 7 years, which was really quite an amazing experience. So I've always had a sort of service-oriented call. And it was only in the past decade that I got into all the literature that's accumulated and realized that I wanted to make it available in a public way through a website. And so Green Med Info was really just a labor of love that only later became popular, where now we get about 1 million unique visitors a month of people just looking for evidence-based information on natural health and actually alternative toxicology, which is where the GMO issue comes in, and agrochemicals. So we house a lot of research that you won't find on CNN and NBC because they're afraid of the implications.
At which point did you decide to put all of this on the web, and how did it happen?
Well, it was actually in about 2008 when I decided. It wasn't really so much a decision, it was this obsessive compulsion. I had run into this database, which most of us know about now, which is Medline. It's through the National Library of Medicine, and it houses 23 million abstracts from studies in peer-reviewed journals. And so it's made available to the world for free, whereas at one point there was a paywall separating it from the public. And most people don't know about it. And when you go in there and you type in a word like glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, although there are many others, as we know, that cause harm in Roundup, you'll see about 2,000 results. And so what I did is spent, originally it was 4 years of probably 40 hours a week, ruined my eyes, unfortunately, because I had to be in front of a computer screen, and indexed out about, at first it was 10,000 abstracts across 1,000 substances and 1,000 ailments. And now today we have about 23,000 abstracts, and it goes over 3,000 ailments and 1,700 natural substances and over 600 problem substances, which could be like drugs or food additives or Roundup or GMOs. So it's just an index, pretty minimalistic, that people can use, open access, and hopefully, educate themselves, which is what I did, when I did the project.
So the important part here is it's evidence-based, which is a lot of people argue in the regular side of medicine that all this alternative stuff is just a bunch of hooey.
Exactly. Well, that's what I found too, is a lot of the science you find indexed there is really just what they call checkbook science. Monsanto or Dow Chemicals goes out and hires a research group to produce results that they want to promote their product. And they have an ethical obligation to publish null or negative findings, but they don't do that, of course. They only publish those findings. It could be 1 in 100 studies performed on Roundup that show that it has some kind of benefit to the environment and even human health. There was a study recently arguing that glyphosate might actually fight cancer, whereas we know it has profound carcinogenicity. So that's kind of also the dark side of the evidence-based model, is that, it's sort of like the whole idea of the golden rule. Those who own the gold make the rules. And in order to create these studies, especially if it's a human trial, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, you have to put in millions of dollars on the front end. And of course, activists or people that are like you and me that don't own vast amounts of resources can't create that kind of literature. So despite that, I will say that the 23,000 studies we found, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, there are literally hundreds of thousands more that we could index, are so liberating, because they often show that, again, many of the chemicals we think are safe, quite the opposite, or that it shows a basic weed or herb growing in your backyard is more powerful than, a blockbuster drug that Merck put out in the market. So that's
Right.
sort of the good part of it.
Speaking on this subject, I just read, actually it just came out yesterday, I believe. UC Davis came out with a quote-unquote, study saying that there's no sign of health or nutrition problems from GMO livestock feeding.
It's
Right?
just absurd, right? How can they make that kind of claim? It's just, with the Seralini study obviously showing profound harm. It's just so sad that they produce this propaganda, and much of the public actually swallows it whole.
Yeah, because they say, well, it's coming from university, so it's got to be right. What they probably don't realize is that Monsanto, Dow Chemicals is behind or paying for the research, or quote unquote supporting the university. So if they've come out with something negative, then all of a sudden the research funds will dry up, right?
It's remarkable. Exactly. And I think, what needs to happen is people need to apply the lens of the precautionary principle. And, they say you can't prove necessarily that anybody has been harmed by a GMO food, through, let's say, epidemiological studies, and certainly very few, if any, randomized trials have been performed seeing their harms in humans. So you extrapolate from animal and cell studies, but then when they show clear harm in that model, they say it's not a human study, so you can't prove that it can hurt humans. So it's a very double standard. And I think people are waking up that, yes, the research model, evidence base, is extremely important, but we also have common sense. And if these chemicals have no precedent in our environment and they exert carcinogenic properties in the parts per trillion range, which is what a study just last year showed, I think we have reason to be concerned about any food that's even touched an agrochemical like Roundup.
One could argue that if you do a study on mice, maybe it would not relate to humans, but then there was a fairly recent study done by a farmer in Sweden on porks, and porks have the same or similar digestive systems than humans. And you tell us the rest of the story. I'm sure you know it, right?
Well, yeah, it's a very interesting problem, because in many ways it's true that the mouse or rodent model doesn't carry over exactly to the human model. There's a lot of misinformation about how well that research carries over. But on the other hand, looking at pigs, there's a remarkable similitude. I mean, you can grow a human ear off the back of a pig. I mean, you can use their insulin. I mean, they have such a similar physiology to us, and even some of their neurology. There's some interesting theories about why that's true. There's a site called macroevolution.net that argues that humans can actually have pig DNA in their genome, and it's extremely compelling. So that's a whole other story. But yes, if you show harm in a pig model, usually that's a very clear indication that humans experience very similar adverse effects. That's my understanding. So yes.
So for people that are not aware of that study, it was done by Dr. Cartman, right?
I believe
And
so.
in conjunction with pig farmers in America, and there's also a pig farmer in Sweden. And basically, they took piglets from birth, from the same mother, from the same litter, split them, separated them in two groups. One of them was fed a regular, pig's feed. The other one was fed genetically engineered pig's feed. And then they allowed the pigs to grow up, and then they killed them, and then they opened them up. And then they did studies on the internal organs, mostly the stomach and the intestines, and they saw huge inflammation and a big difference in the health of the internal organs.
It's amazing. To be expected, too. I think largely the problem has been that we've focused primarily on trans genes being inserted into these novel crops that are produced in this fashion for their proprietary rights. You patent a form of corn, obviously, then you could control it. You can sue a farmer who's trying to grow organic seeds if their corn goes and wildly disseminates into their field. It's absurd that Monsanto's been able to do this. In fact, some people, even Vandana Shiva, indicated that this wild pollination with a transgene pollen is considered biorape. I mean, it's literally like raping another organism. It's a sexual form of horizontal gene transfer, that you can't control and you're exposed to. But the problem has been focused on transgenes for so long, and it's so hard to argue that the transgene could cause a protein that can cause an allergy in a human. And what's happening is that we're realizing that there are all these things called microRNAs within foods, which are non-coding for proteins. So they don't produce, a transgenic antigenic protein. But what they do is they actually go into our digestion, go into our blood and tissue, and then start to epigenetically alter the expression of the nuclear genome within the cells of our body, and actually to the point where it can change the phenotype of the cell. So what we're seeing is that these foods that we've relied on for thousands of years contain information that's gene regulatory, that when you alter through the process of recombinant DNA technology, the information within the food, when you eat it, it alters your genetic expression as well. So they can no longer claim that the issue is just, some people get allergies when they eat genetic soy. It's now a much bigger issue because it's technically called RNA interference technologies, is that these new forms of GMOs that are going to come out in the market don't use the traditional approach. They actually try to silence genes within the GMO plants. And then when you eat those foods, those RNAs can go into your body and silence your own genes. So that's a new thing you'll be hearing about, because Monsanto's actually funded a lot of this research. And I have a study that shows that there are thousands of sequence homologies between the human genome and these foods that we are now going to be seeing altered in this same way. So it's a very, very dangerous movement forward for the biotech industry. But I just want to say that in terms of precaution, what we're doing is unlocking Pandora's box. Once you alter the genetic trajectory of these foods, and it's irreversible, you can't recall these organisms. And once they're in the food chain and actually transferring their genes horizontally to other plants, you just can't control it. So that's why I think we all feel the same, is that yes, we want an end to GMOs because it's the same thing to do. It's not a luxury. It's just a requirement if we want to have healthy biosphere in the future.
What strikes me is the fact that Monsanto scientists must know that their gene silencing technique is passed on to, if you like, higher organisms as it goes down the food chain. So if they know this, there must be, I would say, a more insidious operation going on behind what's dressed up as just better food.
Well, this is a great question, because here's what's happening. There's actually a convergence occurring within the biotech industries from the side of it, which is the GMOs and the food control, to vaccination. The agendas overlap. Now, one thing that's interesting is that Pfizer, it actually owns Monsanto technically. Monsanto is a wholly owned subsidiary of Pfizer. I mean, completely separate financially. But the point is that the multinational drug companies are now developing what are called DNA vaccines. In fact, the Ebola virus might end up being one, the vaccine they're trying to push through now. What it does is it actually takes a viral vector and pushes a certain amount of cells with this infection that then turns them into vaccine antigen producing factories. And then on the other side, you have foods, which are now called biofarmed foods, which are supposed to produce antigen or monoclonal antibodies against certain infectious diseases. And so you're seeing a convergence where now our food is becoming a vaccine producing and our bodies are becoming vaccine producing. And the same corporations, which are the ones who produce the vaccines and they have the biotech subsidiaries, are working on this together. So it almost makes me feel the same. I mean, it's not sheer stupidity that would be causing them to alter our foods and even our bodies through vaccines in this way that almost ensures that we're going to all start degenerating as a species. It seems as if there's actually, in fact, there has been reference to this in the literature, philosophically, ethically. It's called transhumanism. The assumption that somehow you can improve on, nature to the point where creating a synthetic human is going to be the ultimate solution, to how we overcome, plagues and pestilence. And that's really what we're talking about to a degree. Of course, that sounds like kind of conspiracy theory, and I wouldn't be talking about it if I didn't see clear signals in the literature itself that this is happening. So unfortunately, it's almost like science fiction today, as we're living in this like B movie of just complete absurdity, and yet people aren't really, they're still calling us crazy and we're, activists, when it's just the science saying that this is where they're going.
Yeah. I mean, I was having a conversation yesterday with a friend of mine, and he was saying, well, what do you think is the main game plan? I said, well, it strikes me as decidedly odd that the nutrients that we get from our food are being denatured. The poisons that we get in our food are on the increase, which is causing us as organisms to degenerate. And the pharmaceutical industry is coming in with a whole raft of new drugs that they're going to sell us. And I said exactly the same thing as you did. I said, if you follow the money back, the companies that own the food producing companies also own the pharmaceutical producing companies. So one is feeding the bank account of the other.
There's a movie coming up, it's called Bart, and I was helping them in Indiegogo, and it's exposing the whole connection between the food and the pharmaceutical and the medical and the Wall Street connection. It's all connected.
Shock
horror.
Yeah.
It's a great movie. Jeffrey Hayes put together. He's one of our advisory board members is involved in it as well. But very, very good that people are getting this awareness out. I think I have an article here from 2008 that Monsanto company produced, and it's about the production of these microRNAs in these food crops of historical significance and how they overlap with thousands of sequences within the human genome. And of course, what they say is that the abundance of these small RNA molecules in grain from safely consumed food and feed crops such as soybean, corn, rice, and basically indicates a history of safe consumption for them, meaning they're saying because of these overlaps already existing so long, that's why they're safe. But I draw the exact opposite conclusion. So this is a way that this corporation looks at how they're tinkering, at the fundamental sort of code of life is it's exactly opposite common sense and the precautionary principle. But this is the future of GMOs. And then here's the third issue I identify. We're emerging past this concept of, GMOs cause allergens. And now, yes, GMOs tinker with the RNA, so it could shut down all the genes in your body. But there's the other clear problem, which is they're all contaminated with agrochemicals because of their intrinsic design. You take a warfare model, the very corporations that produced Agent Orange are still producing these agrochemicals for our food crops, and you apply a systemic herbicide designed for the war theater, and you just carpet bomb an entire swath of land including, the people that are going to collaterally poison with a poison that kills everything there, including things like insects as well as the microbial biodiversity in the soil. You're basically creating a Death Star. I mean, again, it sounds like science fiction. You're killing everything you can with these biocides. Now with stack trait plants and, Dow's new enlist, you have 2,4-D, which is, of course, a major ingredient in Agent Orange, and then glyphosate stacked on top. And you're just poisoning the entire biosphere to produce what? A food that's contaminated with these very chemicals, which in parts per million, trillion, billion, could be causing profound changes in your cells consistent with cancer. I mean, this is obscene. It's so absurd that if people, like, why don't people see how clearly we have to deconstruct that model and stop buying anything that isn't clearly vetted to be clean of these chemicals? Otherwise, there is no future for any of us. I mean, literally.
Right. Unfortunately, it seems that most people, that is the general population, is more interested in getting their hands in the latest iPhone 6 than, they're being concerned of the future of our Earth, environment, and health. But this is your job, my job, our job to get the word out, even though we may sound a little crazy people, in the beginning.
Yeah.
I do believe firmly that GMO issue is going to be the major food issue in the years to come. And
Yes.
I mean, obviously you've been involved in it for a lot longer than me, but we still are the pioneers in this fight. And, I want to thank you very much for the hard work you put up so far.
Well, thank
How do
you.
you think that GMOs will be affecting our, eventually our health and environment?
Well, because of the way in which the model applied is monoculture based, right? So it's almost like the concept of monotheism. Let's go back in time when you had literally thousands and thousands of cultural systems. And then you had this appearance suddenly of this concept of there's one God and there's one way to truth. And if you don't follow us, guess what? We're going to actually kill you. Okay? The same is applying on a basic level to the biosphere, is that any plant that isn't consistent with this model of taking the arable surface of the land, converting it to a handful of GMO crops, and then poisoning everything else that's there just so you don't have to get into the harder work of organically managing pests and amending the soil. And so by the end of that process, you have literally created a environment that will no longer support health. Like, we are basically bacteria, a meta-organism. 99% of our genetic content comes from the microbes in our body. And so what you're doing as well when you're applying these systemic herbicides, which you might as well apply chemotherapy or antibiotics broad spectrum to the land, is you're destroying the microbes that are at the root of our own health and that we have co-evolved with in the little niches of our environments, our diets. So when you've eliminated those bacteria, and some of them are bacteriophage viruses, which have information as well, certain fungi are actually beneficial, then you've destroyed the root of our health going into the future. Not only just the foods that, the main argument, of course, is GMOs save the world, billions of people from dying because we can make the crops better, and it's absolutely absurd. With climate change occurring at the pace it is, there has to be a natural resilience within the different strains of food crops that exist within a sort of a natural ecosystem, and we're destroying all of that amazing information that enables these plants through their different varieties to thrive within different environmental situations, and the whole model is destroying that possibility as well. So it's guaranteeing billions will starve in the future. So so on an individual and a global basis, the GMO model is not based on anything scientific in terms of helping us with our health. It's based on literally a military model of production, and it's really more about controlling populations, not just even profiting longer. It's truly about what I liken it to, the sort of bread and circus model in Rome, where you basically gave away free bread, which was pretty much, lobotomizing the public and getting them addicted, and you entertained them with your wonderful coliseums and your blood sports, etc. That's pretty much what we're doing, I think, as well. Poisoning people makes them sick, feeds the military, medical, industrial establishment, and then you hopefully continue your agenda, So unfortunately, that's the truth, I think.
The whole thing sounds to me like contrary to their claims, what we might be looking into is the actual desertification of huge swaths of the land, because they're killing the earth, they're killing the ground, and all the living organism, and they're basically growing these crops based on chemicals only, which is
Yes.
eventually going to turn into deserts, right?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, the fact that the USGS did several studies showing that almost all the air samples they tested had some measurable glyphosate in them. Like the rain has it in it, the groundwater. There's really nothing you can test today that doesn't have some residue of these herbicides. They bioaccumulate. They don't degrade like biodegradable things should. So as we move forward and continue to apply billions and billions of more gallons of these agrochemicals into the environment, there's just nowhere left for them to go but up the food chain. And we're perched precariously on the top. We're the omnivore, and we are the ones who suffer the most. In fact, the worst suffering members of our species are the infants receiving breast milk. The most healing, profound substance on the planet has bioaccumulated more toxins, from dioxins to radioisotopes to heavy metals than any other substance. And so that's really what we're talking about, is that there's only a few generations left, in theory, for the general public that won't succumb to severe disease within their first decade of life. And then, of course, with the neurological, disaster induced by vaccines and many other factors, we'll have 1 in 10 children with a neurodegenerative or neurological issue within the next decade. So yes, it's clear that we've got to start somewhere. And I mean, for me, food is the place where we are empowered most. You put it in your mouth or you don't. You can't determine what you're breathing or what you're seeing half the time, but food is where we have to take our stand, and vaccines, because no one should be able to pierce your body with anything without your voluntary permission.
Not to fall all the way back to the dark side, but on the positive side, we are seeing more and more people concerned and being aware that their food is being attacked, and they are starting to make changes. And thanks to people like us and Jeffrey Smith and many other great people out there that are actually getting the word out, people are starting to change their buying habits and being concerned and buying more organic or healthier crops, or being aware of the potentials for GMO to hurt us and their children. I'm connected with a group. It's called Moms Across America. That is fighting GMOs, hardly. So on the positive side, there's a grassroots movement of people realizing that we are going toward disaster if we, the people, don't do anything, because, God forbid, our government is not doing anything. Corporations are, making things worse. So what would you suggest that we as the people do in order to fight this?
Well, I mean, you're right. So much positive has been happening in just the past few years that it's really important to point that out. The March Against Monsanto protest that took on global movement was very exciting, because before that there were a handful of people out there kind of saying, this is what's happening, and they were actually targets. GMO activists were being monitored by the U.S. government. In fact, even our website has a lot of .mils and .dhs, and we're tracked, as if we're somehow terrorists, because we're actually just putting out research on the adverse effects. So when everybody came together and said, enough's enough, you had millions of people in the streets saying, we want a GMO-free world. It was just so liberating, and it was such a positive sign. I think that what's happening is, with the non-GMO initiative, and people starting to realize that even the USDA organic label isn't as meaningful than a non-GMO label, because I don't know if people know this. You can go get Horizon or Organic Valley milk, and they're injected with vaccines. It's on their page, literally, and some of them contain genetically modified yeast and other things that someone that's a non-GMO person can't put in their body. So the USDA organic standards have been watered down significantly, whereas non-GMO means non-GMO. So people are starting to become more complex in their awareness and buying decisions. So I think things are actually looking up when it comes to consumer awareness and our ability to just take back control, with our dollar, our main means of voting is really our dollar, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, because obviously voting for politicians hasn't helped us a bit.
Yeah, no, it's
Yeah,
true. Yeah.
I'm sure Mark has an opinion on that. Mark?
Well, it is noticeable in France that the non-GMO label on packaging is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It started off a few years ago as sort of just as part of the text in the description, but now you go around the supermarkets, and it went from a text to a little red button to it's gradually getting bigger now, which is good to see.
That's great. Yeah, that's a sign we're making progress for sure.
Yeah.
Can you give us samples of successful actions done by the Global GMO-Free Coalition?
Yeah, the Global GMO Free Coalition was put together by Henry Rollins from Sustainable Pulse, who's a really wonderful young activist. He's in Venice right now. That's where he's based. And he was working with a lot of scientists, a lot of whom felt that by going out there and even publishing research that is not political in any way, just showing an adverse effect, were being threatened with losing their jobs and also just being characterized as a bad scientist. So one of the points behind the coalition was simply to create sort of an awareness that we need to sort of protect the scientists who are out there doing this, and get a media contact, be a point of contact for the media that is just very clear-headed, and we're not sensationalistic. We're just trying to get out information in a responsible way. So far they've done a good job. After launching just, this year, there are a number of groups that are banding together, and the main thing is you have people like Vandana Shiva, and you have Ronnie Cummins, and I'm extremely excited to be on the steering committee too. It's just about bringing together a global sort of coalition, so we're not fragmented and we can all kind of work together. So I think just the existence of it right now and people becoming aware of it, like thanks for bringing it up, is important, because we just want to be a source for credible information and just get the awareness out to as many people as possible.
So, in your opinion, where do you see the anti-GMO movement in a few years? Do you think there'll be success?
Well, I like using the word non-GMO as well, because, I mean, obviously, based on what we've talked about, you could characterize me as an anti-GMO person, which is very true. But the whole concept of just having a choice, and sort of always like non-harm, the whole strategy, which Vandana Shiva, of course, has been telling us that that's what needs to happen with this movement. Just much like Gandhi was able to oust imperial, Britain from India, so is true for this movement. As long as we are being responsible, we're not attacking, we're not doing things like, this recent debacle with someone putting a site together, Monsanto collaborators, and putting like the swastika on it and trying to make it seem like, some of these paid shills are evil. I don't believe that. They're misguided and they're making some bad choices, but certainly we don't want to fall into that camp, and we want to keep the discussion open. And we want people to be able to at least choose not to have GMOs, which requires that there's labeling and that there's a truth in labeling. If that's not happening, then the onus, the liability is on those who are concealing it, and they should truly be held accountable. So I think we're doing well. I think that based on what I see, we'll have many more options moving into the future. Just in our daily decisions, purchasing, like you go to a restaurant, is this GMO? That will no longer be a strange question. And eventually it'll work its way up, the supply chain and the corporate, hierarchy, and they'll realize, like, it's time. Like, it's not worth their investment in GMOs or their saving on the front end when the consumer's just not going to buy the stuff.
On this subject, there's already quite a few good actions out there. What is it? GMO Inside is trying to encourage Starbucks to change, from all their dairy products from GMO loaded to non-GMO. They already work on the brand of Greek yogurt. So this organization, and we as the consumers, are putting pressure on the corporation, because that's the weak point. If they want their customers to continue to buy their products, they need to come clean. So that's a good way to action. Now, on the more practical side, can you tell our listeners what should they do to avoid GMOs?
Well, one of the things that's clear is the GMO food chain, so to speak, starts with a lot of the foods that in the paleo movement, thankfully, and the ancestral health movement, I should say, excludes. So a lot of those monocultures are going to be grains or legumes like soy. You have obviously corn. Those are major issues in a diet that I personally try to keep free of grains. And that also includes the higher iteration of that, which is, the grain-fed meats. The same problem applies. It's even worse when it comes to the accumulation of the toxic byproducts of these GMO foods, which include the dysbiosis that occurs in the guts of these animals. They end up having things like Clostridium botulinum growth and other pathogenic bacteria that produce all types of disgusting inflammatory byproducts that end up in their blood and their tissue, and then you have the agrochemicals. So what you got to do is really just stay away from the grains generally and the grain-fed meats, and then in place of that, you start doing things like going to the local farmers market and getting the vegetables, the root vegetables, or like things like cruciferous, kale, that you couldn't possibly grow in a GMO model or a monocultured model. Is that those are the foods you'd be producing in your backyard, with a little garden. And that's really, I think, the key in terms of food freedom and liberating and unplugging from this globalization of our food system that not only, of course, requires the use of, GMOs, but the irradiation technology. The whole nuclear industry has put their chips on this concept, and this is being established through the World Trade Organization as well, that in order for countries to trade food globally, that we have to irradiate the food with literally millions of times the chest x-rays worth of radiation. And that's what's required. You have to kill, devitalize the food to the point where it can be on a shelf for a decade. And that's why globalizing our food supply is so insane, not to mention all the fossil fuel energy that goes into even distributing it, which is a whole nother issue. So that's the good news. The GMO movement plugs into a lot of other really sane ones, but it's really about localized food and food that is more consistent with ancestral tradition. And that's going to, I think, largely exclude grains, for example.
So it sounds to me like the paleo and the low carb people are doing the right thing. Avoid all grains, all beans and pulses, avoid all processed foods, stick to fresh, good quality, organic if possible, fresh foods, and grass-fed beef, pasture-raised poultry, these kind of healthy choices, and pick and choose. Pick and choose. I mean, avoid packaged food, avoid anything that is highly processed, and you'll stay healthy, and you basically bypass the whole GMO issue.
Yeah, really focusing on fat, because I think that's where we've gone mostly wrong, is consuming high quality saturated fats, coconut, for example, palm, and then even butter has great value. Switching away from being dependent on a carbohydrate or sugar-based sort of metabolism, which is one of the things that we do in the Western world. So, and then I think that's really the direction one wants to move.
So it sounds to me like the non-GMO movement and the paleo movement are really hand in hand in this effect.
I think so. Yeah, I think you're right about that. There's a lot of overlap, and I think the paleo movement can learn from incorporating more carbohydrate. There's a really innovative doctor out there, Dr. Kelly Brogan, who worked with a lot of women specifically and found that her ideal diet, the carb ratio about 40% fat, 40% the rest protein, was based on breast milk inadvertently, which has a similar ratio. And so in the paleo movement, it's been sort of almost a gender-biased approach sometimes. The male metabolism physiology is taken for granted. So I think it's about context and bio-individualizing the diet. So I think we do maybe want to add more carbohydrate in, and I actually allow for legumes to a degree, especially if you don't want to eat meat. So it's just really going to be a matter of finding out what's right for you.
I know you've done some research and written about it. What's your feeling about this whole Ebola disease and how it's been handled?
Well, it is a very strange fact that the U.S. government holds a patent, of course, on Ebola. And there is, it's a publicly available patent. There's been a lot written about it. And then also just this notion that they already had drugs in development for an outbreak, one of which is called ZMapp, and it's a monoclonal antibody produced, believe it or not, by what's called a hybridoma. It's a tumor produced from mouse spleen cells mixed in with multiple myeloma cells, and the tumor just literally spits out these monoclonal antibodies. And unfortunately, this model has been found to harbor what are potentially carcinogenic retroviruses within the actual product. So there's so much to this, like in the way they're fast tracking the vaccines, that I am very distrustful, because the reality is in West Africa, where a lot of these infectious diseases have such high mortality, morbidity, you're dealing with some of the most nutrient-starved, the most toxified. They don't have sanitation, adequate sanitation, nutrition, and the stress alone, from the geopolitical issues. That's not a situation like here in the U.S. So the whole handling of this, the ratcheting up of the fear, we saw this with the swine flu, which was a really bad joke on the world that the WHO coordinated, of course, is that, there's a flip side to this. I do feel that it is a very dangerous virus in those who are susceptible. But I do also think one should look at where it came from, because there were well-known vaccination campaigns in that area stretching back half a century before this suddenly emerged out of nowhere. And if you know about how they created the original attenuated vaccines, they literally crossed over through different species, contaminated cells that then recombined to form highly virulent viruses. So my thing is really people need to look beneath the surface and look at the backstory and do their own research. And yes, there are natural things that have been studied. I did a review on Green Med Info, genistein, which is found in coffee and red clover and soy. That's one of the things that's been actually studied to potentially help inhibit the Ebola virus. So there are some natural compounds that won't probably get any attention ever. But if you go on Green Med Info, you go on Medline, you search Ebola, you'll actually find some research on potential natural interventions as well.
Can you list some of them, for example, in case people are interested to at least maybe, who knows, prepare for it?
Yes. Yes, I mean, there's been a study we actually we published on Green Med on vitamin C, intravenous high dose, and they actually give a protocol of what they feel would be the ideal way to administer it given, an Ebola infection. Let's see, there's been research on some homeopathic interventions. One of them is based on spider venom, in fact, which is very interesting. The problem is that this is a relatively unstudied topic. So when we did our little review, it's called Natural Treatments for Ebola Virus Exists, Research Suggests. If you go on Green Med Info, you'll see the article. Garcinia cola was studied as far back as 1999. And even estrogen, believe it or not, estradiol, has been studied as a way to inhibit. And this was a screening of FDA-approved drugs as inhibitors for Ebola, which is interesting. It'd be interesting to find out if women are less prone to getting Ebola infection, because there's a hormonal component. So yes, I think there are many, in those who live in a developed nation where this is obviously not a threat immediately, I would be more concerned about supporting overall immunity, avoiding, obviously, immunotoxic chemicals in foods, and not fall prey to fear, because that is one of the best ways to downregulate immunity, is just unjustified, sort of self-perpetuating fear. And that's unfortunately part of this whole meme that's being driven globally, I think, in preparation for some products that are obviously in development for us here.
Yeah, so obviously they are building the excitement, if you will, or the fear, to the point where they're going to eventually tell us we all have to be vaccinated the same way as the pig flu.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So
that's right.
There might be some business involvement behind that as well, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very true. One of the products they're trying to produce is through tobacco, and it's a genetically modified form that produces an antibody to Ebola, supposedly. So obviously it's even relevant to the whole GMO vaccine convergence we were talking about earlier.
Coming back to GMOs a bit, obviously there are, or rather there is an increased uptake in GMO usage. At the moment, where would you say is the most contaminated place to live?
Wow, that's a really good question. Well, it's definitely in the GMO saturated regions of probably this country would be the Midwest, I'm imagining. But you'll find evidence in regions like Sri Lanka where they found suddenly this massive outbreak of kidney failure in areas where they're applying a lot of glyphosate. So I think that health-wise, the biggest risk, of course, is Roundup. And wherever it's being applied as sort of a broad spectrum herbicide, that is where it's likely the health is going to be most compromised. Not necessarily those who are eating the most of it. It's really the chemical fallout that I think has the most immediate adverse effects. The chronic effects of eating, Roundup contaminated GMOs, they're going to extend generations into the future, I imagine.
We have already examples in India and in the Philippines where they grow cotton and crops that are heavily GMO and heavily blanketed by glyphosate and Roundup. There's already been proven that a lot of people that live in the area, work in these fields, are getting sick.
It's true, especially workers, absolutely. Even the spouses of workers, there were studies done on their urine levels. It's unfortunate, but it's a very powerful contaminant. It ends up in the air, the rain. So once you're in a region where it's being used, there really isn't a way to protect yourself from it, and that's why it's such a socially irresponsible quote farming technique, is that it shouldn't cause collateral harm to everyone who's not had no choice in the matter. It's just completely unfair. It's very much like Agent Orange applied in Vietnam. It's still a war-based model, and it causes a lot of collateral damage, so to speak.
I've had farmers take me to task and saying, well, we all need to make a living, and how dare you, spread all this fear because it's harming our business. What's your answer to that?
I would say they are no longer farmers, and they shouldn't use such a sacred name to describe their vocation. I'm sorry, but farming involves people with their hands in their soil, who are aware of the fact you don't use a biocide, which literally means kill life, to quote farm, and then that biocide just contaminates the plant, including its metabolites, because AMPA is produced within the plant. The plant barely lives. It's full of oxidative damage, and there's probably thousands of downstream adverse effects that happen. So I am sorry, those who claim to be farmers who are using these chemicals should really reconsider what they're doing, because it's not farming when you're affecting the future generations of the planet. I mean, literally. It's just too sacred a name for me to apply to someone using that model.
Coming back to the question I asked earlier. So we've looked at the most contaminated areas. Where would you say is the safest place to live as far as GMOs go?
So I have a friend who's been looking at this issue through a number of lenses, including radioactive fallout, which if you know anything about Fukushima, we've probably already been affected. And then you look at the 70-plus reactors that are destined to either melt down or eventually have all their, stored rods get into the environment. He was saying the mountains of Peru probably the best place. You want to get in the southern hemisphere because there's a disproportionate number of nuclear accidents about to happen in the northern hemisphere, and then not too heavy in GMOs. So good question, right? I think it's very difficult right now to isolate oneself, and there are certainly risks involved anywhere you live. So one of the philosophies is you just stay in the moment where you are and you do the best you can, and you just apply a very spiritual lens to the experience, like we humans having a spiritual experience or vice versa. If you believe the latter, then really it doesn't become as devastating as it would seem otherwise. We just have to kind of do our best where we are at, I guess.
Okay. Right, so are you saying that Mark and our generation, the old farts, we're going to be probably the most healthy generation, and everything goes downhill from there? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it seems that way. I think it's really just going to depend on how much progress we all make. Because like you're saying, if Starbucks pulls their RBGH, genetically modified growth hormone from the milk, the millions of gallons probably used daily, that one step alone could have huge downstream effects. So and if people just stopped eating GMO corn, I mean, it would put to a halt, this just juggernaut-like process that's occurring. So there's ways that we can all make progress locally and globally, but it's, I think, going to just depend. Certainly, it's hard to predict the future. I don't want to be too much of a doom and gloom guy, but I think everybody out there can make some real choices that are going to have real effects right now. Just don't buy GMO and help educate people.
Now, I understand you sit on a number of advisory boards and so forth.
Well, a few of them are just really great organizations, like Fearless Parent, which is a parent-centered way to get this information out to people. Because if you focus on the science, and it's a bunch of scientists out there arguing with each other in this highly technical language. Who knows what anything means? But the reality is, if you're a mom and you don't want your kid to have GMO food at lunch in school, well, guess what? You have every right to go in there and tell them something needs to change, or you can make the lunch for them. Or if you don't want them vaccinated with, a genetically modified yeast with HPV antigen woven in, which is Gardasil, then you should have the right. And then, of course, the Non-GMO Coalition is one of my favorites. And then the National Health Federation, I'm deeply honored to be part of, because they were the country's first health freedom organization, and they're the ones who have a seat at the Codex. I may actually be attending as a delegate coming up in Bali. And what they do is they argue for things like limiting the amount of chemicals in the food, or raising up the nutritional requirements, which the Codex community is kind of trying to do the opposite with. Like vitamin C is treated like a drug. 50 milligrams a day is enough, or too much if you have more than that. And what we're trying to do is get some sanity back in the picture, and try to get people to realize that no, GMOs are not good, chemicals are not good for you, and nutrients are actually good things that people should have.
Right. As a chef and nutritionist, I always recommend people get their nutrients directly from food and from their diet. And as long as you pick the right quality, then you're most likely to be okay. I mean, you can always supplement a little bit here and there, but typically it's still our best choice is to get the kind of vitamins, minerals our body actually needs.
Chefs are doing the best work of all. They're the ones taking recipes, which is a really interesting etymology. It's French for medical prescription, the word recipe. So I believe that these recipes carried down from past generations have information that can literally keep your genome optimized and healthy, that no doctor can ever find a prescription for, certainly. And even some of these advanced nutritionists don't have the wisdom embedded in grandma's, recipe. So chefs kind of know this intuitively.
I'm involved in the food side of business with other chefs and everything, even though I'm not a practicing chef as myself, but I'm still connected with all these young chefs that are really making an effort to offer their customers locally grown, fresh, good quality foods. And we in the food business could also be part of the solution and educate our customers that the food that we eat is extremely important. The quality of the food we eat is extremely important, not just all the scientific side of it, but the down-to-earth, every meal, focus on the quality.
It's so important because we know now that our gene expression isn't dependent on the primary sequence within the actual DNA within the cell, right? The genome. It's based on environmental factors, really, and nutrition is number one on the list. So the foods you eat help to regulate your DNA, turn on certain genes, turn off certain genes, and that's what keeps our body whole and healthy. So, to me, nutrition applied, which is what chefs focus on, is where medicine is obviously, you don't need medicine if you're getting that good food. So that's even more important than even natural medicine in certain respects to me, is good food, delivered in the right way.
The old saying, use food as your medicine should make complete sense. It's either you use food as medicine now and you enjoy good quality food and great meals, or you're going to pay a lot of money to pharmaceutical companies and hospitals and doctors later on if you don't. At least that's been my position all along, focus on the
Yes.
quality of food and stay healthy now instead of not paying attention, and eventually you're going to end up paying a lot more with your health and your bills. Sayer, so how do we find information about you and your different organizations?
Oh, great. Yeah. If you go to greenmedinfo.com, so green is in the color, med is in med, and info is information. You just go there. We have a newsletter that's pretty popular. We have 120,000 people on it. It's daily. And that's where we have our latest research. And if there are events, like a lot of free online events we get involved in, they can stay abreast there. And then Facebook, we have a pretty active community as well. So we post 12 different pieces of content a day there. So you can find us at Green Med Info on Facebook.
Okay. I'll make sure to connect with you there.
Anything you think we should add in?
No, just thank you for your work because, for me, there's two really powerful movements in nutrition. Of course, the non-GMO is huge and the organic, biodynamic, but also the quote paleo or getting back to ancestral nutrition. So for me, it's where my passion is. I feel like we're kind of like archaeologists sort of digging up these deeper layers of our metabolism and physiology and starting to really unlock the key to optimal health. And that's what I think you guys are doing a great job on educating. So I'm just very honored to, be part of your show and look forward to watching your future episodes myself.
Thank you again, Sayer, for being on the Low Carb Paleo show.
Yes.
And as we say in Texas, à votre santé, y'all.
I'm jealous of you.